November 9th, 2003, started like any ordinary Saturday for the Collins family. Jennifer Collins woke up that morning in their modest two-story home in Naperville, Illinois, a quiet suburb about 30 miles southwest of Chicago. Her daughters, Amanda and Rachel, were already awake, sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal and talking about their plans for the day. Amanda was 14, a freshman in high school with long brown hair she wore in a ponytail most days. She was responsible, the kind of teenager who got good grades and followed rules. Rachel was 11, still in elementary school, with the same brown hair as her sister but cut shorter, just past her shoulders. She was quieter than Amanda, more reserved, but the two were inseparable. The girls had been asking for weeks if they could go to Riverside Mall on their own. It was a big shopping center about 20 minutes from their house, the kind of place teenagers went on weekends to hang out, browse stores, and feel independent. Jennifer had been hesitant at first. Amanda was old enough, certainly, but Rachel was still so young. David, their father, had reassured Jennifer that the mall was safe, that Amanda was responsible enough to watch her sister. They'd set ground rules: stay together at all times, don't leave the mall, and be at the food court at 4 o'clock sharp for pickup. Amanda had rolled her eyes but agreed. Rachel had nodded eagerly, thrilled at the idea of a day without parents hovering. That Saturday morning, Jennifer drove the girls to Riverside Mall. It was overcast, the kind of gray November day where the sky felt low and heavy. The mall parking lot was already filling up by the time they arrived just after 1 in the afternoon. Jennifer pulled up near the north entrance and turned to face her daughters in the back seat. She handed Amanda two $20 bills and told them to be smart with the money. Pretzels, maybe a smoothie, maybe something small from one of the stores if they found something they liked. She reminded them again to stay together. Amanda promised they would. Rachel smiled and said they'd be fine. Jennifer watched as the girls got out of the car, backpacks slung over their shoulders, and walked toward the entrance. She waited until they disappeared through the glass doors before pulling away. Inside the mall, Amanda and Rachel felt a rush of freedom. It was crowded, full of shoppers, carrying bags, groups of teenagers clustered near the fountain, the smell of cinnamon rolls and coffee drifting from the food court. Security cameras captured them entering at 1:15 in the Propson's afternoon. The footage, grainy and time-stamped, shows two girls in jeans and jackets, Amanda in a red hoodie, Rachel in a blue one. They're smiling, talking, walking side by side. They look like any other pair of sisters enjoying a Saturday afternoon. For the next hour and a half, the girls moved through the mall at a leisurely pace. They stopped at a bookstore and flipped through magazines. They browsed a store that sold accessories, cheap jewelry, hair clips, keychains. At 2:30, they went to the food court and used some of their money to buy soft pretzels and sodas. Security footage shows them sitting at a table near the center of the food court, eating and talking. Amanda is gesturing with her hands, telling a story. Rachel is laughing. They look happy, relaxed, safe. At 2:47, the girls left the food court and headed to the second floor. The mall had 2 levels connected by escalators and a central atrium. The second floor was where most of the clothing stores were located. Amanda and Rachel walked into a store called Teen Trends, a popular chain that sold inexpensive clothes aimed at teenagers. The store's internal cameras captured them browsing through racks of shirts and jeans. Amanda held up a sweater and showed it to Rachel, who shook her head. They spent about 15 minutes inside, trying on a few items, but not buying anything. At 3:02 in the afternoon, they exited Teen Trends and turned left, walking toward the East Corridor. That was the last confirmed sighting of Amanda and Rachel Collins. The East Corridor was a less crowded section of the mall, lined with smaller stores and a few service doors. Security cameras in that area were sparse, positioned at odd angles, and some weren't functioning properly. The footage from the corridor shows dozens of people passing through between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. But Amanda and Rachel are not clearly visible in any of it. Detectives would later spend weeks analyzing every frame, trying to identify the girls in the crowd. But the resolution was poor, the lighting dim, and the angles unhelpful. It was as if the girls had simply walked into a blind spot and disappeared. By 4:15, Jennifer Collins was parked near the food court entrance, waiting. She scanned the crowds of people leaving the mall, looking for her daughters. 4:20, 4:30. She started to feel uneasy. Amanda was punctual. She wouldn't be this late without calling. Jennifer pulled out her cell phone and dialed Amanda's number. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. She waited another 10 minutes, then got out of the car and walked into the mall. Jennifer went straight to the food court, the designated meeting spot. No sign of the girls. She walked through the surrounding stores, looking down every aisle, checking bathrooms. Her heart was beating faster now. She stopped a mall security guard and asked if he'd seen two girls, one in a red hoodie, one in blue. He hadn't. Jennifer called David. He told her to stay calm, that the girls probably lost track of time. But Jennifer's instinct told her something was wrong. By 5 o'clock, Jennifer was frantic. She found the mall's main security office and demanded they help her look. The security staff took her seriously. They radioed guards stationed throughout the mall and began a sweep of the building. They checked every store, every bathroom, every corner. They reviewed the security footage from the past few hours, looking for Amanda and Rachel. They found the footage of the girls entering the mall, eating at the food court, shopping at Teen Trends. But after 3:02, nothing. At 6:30, Jennifer called the police. Naperville Police Department responded quickly, sending officers to the mall within 15 minutes. By 7, a full search was underway. Officers walked through every level of the mall, questioning employees and shoppers. Had anyone seen two girls, 14 and 11, one in a red hoodie, one in blue? A few people thought they remembered seeing them earlier in the day, but no one could say for certain where they'd gone. After leaving Teen Trends, the mall was searched top to bottom. Storage rooms, employee areas, parking garages, the surrounding grounds. Nothing. David Collins arrived at the mall just after 7:30. He found Jennifer sitting in the security office, her face pale, her hands shaking. Police were asking her questions. What were the girls wearing? Did they have cell phones? Had there been any recent problems at home? Any arguments? Any reason they might run away? Jennifer answered through tears. No, there were no problems. Amanda and Rachel were good kids. They wouldn't run away. They wouldn't leave. Without telling her, something had happened. Something terrible. By 9 o'clock that night, Riverside Mall was closed to the public, but police remained inside, continuing their search. Detectives were already reviewing security footage, trying to piece together the girls' movements. Officers interviewed every employee who'd been working that day. Janitors, cashiers, security guards. No one had seen anything unusual. No one remembered the girls specifically, except for Melissa Hart, the cashier at Teen Trends, who said they'd tried on clothes but left empty-handed. She remembered them because they seemed like nice kids, polite, laughing together. She didn't see where they went after leaving the store. The mall's security director provided police with all available footage from November 9th. Hours and hours of grainy, time-stamped video. Detectives watched it over and over, tracking Amanda and Rachel through the mall. Every movement, every turn, every store they entered. The footage was maddeningly incomplete. There were gaps, blind spots, areas where the cameras didn't reach or weren't working. The East Corridor was one of those areas. After the girls left Teen Trends at 3:02, they walked toward the east side of the second floor. And then they were gone. By midnight, an Amber Alert was issued for Amanda and Rachel Collins. Their photos were broadcast on local news stations. The description was read on radio stations across Illinois. Two sisters, last seen at Riverside Mall in suburban Chicago. Amanda, 14, 5'4", brown hair, brown eyes, wearing a red hoodie and jeans. Rachel, 11, 5'1", brown hair, brown eyes, wearing a blue hoodie and jeans. Anyone with information was urged to call the Naperville Police Department immediately. Jennifer and David stayed at the mall until after 1 in the morning, refusing to leave, clinging to the hope that the girls would walk out of a store or emerge from a bathroom, confused but unharmed. But as the hours passed, that hope began to crack. Police told them to go home, to try to rest, that the search would continue through the night. Jennifer didn't want to leave. She felt like if she stayed, if she kept looking, she'd find them. David finally convinced her to go, promising they'd come back first thing in the morning. On the drive home, neither of them spoke. The silence was unbearable. When they walked into their house, it felt empty in a way it never had before. Amanda's backpack was on the couch, where she'd left it that morning. Rachel's homework was still spread out on the dining room table. Their bedrooms were exactly as they'd left them. Everything was the same, except the two people who made the house feel like a home were gone. Jennifer sat on the edge of Amanda's bed and stared at the walls. Posters of boy bands and movie stars, a bulletin board covered in photos of friends, a stuffed bear Rachel had given Amanda for her birthday years ago. Jennifer reached out and touched the bear, and that's when the reality hit her. Her daughters were missing. They'd been missing for hours, and no one knew where they were. Detective Michael Brennan got the call just after midnight on November 10th. He'd been with the Naperville Police Department for 15 years, working everything from burglaries to assaults to the occasional homicide. But missing children cases always hit different. They carried a weight that never left you, even after you closed the file. Brennan was at home when his phone rang, half asleep on the couch with the television on low. His lieutenant told him 2 sisters had disappeared from Riverside Mall that afternoon. No signs of them since just after 3 in the afternoon. Brennan asked if they'd checked with friends, relatives, any place the girls might have gone. His lieutenant said they'd checked everything. The girls were gone. Brennan arrived at the mall just before 1 in the morning. Police were still inside, combing through every corner of the building. He met with the officers who'd responded first, reviewed the initial reports, and then sat down with Jennifer and David Collins. They were in the mall security office, both of them looking like they'd aged 10 years in the span of a few hours. Jennifer's eyes were red from crying. David sat with his hands clasped together, his jaw tight. Brennan introduced himself and told them he'd do everything possible to find their daughters. Then he started asking questions. Jennifer described the morning, how she'd dropped the girls off, the rules they'd agreed on. She told Brennan that Amanda was responsible, that she'd never break the rules or do something reckless. Rachel was even more cautious, shy around strangers, always staying close to her sister. Brennan asked if there had been any problems at home recently, any arguments, any reason the girls might want to run away. Jennifer shook her head. No, she said. Everything was fine. They were a normal family. No issues. David confirmed it. He said the girls were happy. They had friends. They did well in school. There was no reason they'd leave. Brennan asked about the girls' friends, anyone they might have planned to meet at the mall. Jennifer said they didn't mention meeting anyone. It was supposed to be just the 2 of them. Brennan asked if the girls had cell phones. Jennifer said Amanda had one, a basic flip phone, but she wasn't answering. Police had already tried calling it multiple times. The phone was either off or out of battery. Brennan made a note to get the phone records as soon as possible. Over the next 48 hours, Brennan and his team worked nonstop. They reviewed every second of security footage from November 9th. The mall had dozens of cameras positioned throughout the building, covering entrances, exits, escalators, and high-traffic areas. Brennan watched the footage of Amanda and Rachel entering at 1:15. He watched them browse stores, eat pretzels in the food court, laugh and talk. They looked like normal kids having a normal day. Nothing about their behavior suggested distress or fear. They weren't looking over their shoulders. They weren't being followed. They were just shopping. At 2:47, the girls entered Teen Trends. Brennan watched them move through the wet store, holding up clothes, chatting with each other. At 3:02, they left. The camera at the store entrance captured them walking out and turning left toward the east corridor. Brennan froze the frame, zooming in on their faces. Amanda was smiling. Rachel was adjusting her backpack. They looked fine. And then they walked out of frame. Brennan switched to the cameras covering the east corridor. This is where things got frustrating. The corridor had 3 cameras, but 2 of them had been malfunctioning for weeks. The mall's security director admitted they'd been meaning to fix them, but hadn't gotten around to it. The one working camera was positioned at the far end of the corridor, pointed toward the food court. It captured people walking in both directions, but the angle was poor, and the resolution was worse. Brennan watched the footage from 3:02 to 4 o'clock. Dozens of people passed through. Families, teenagers, couples. But he couldn't definitively identify Amanda or Rachel in any of the frames. Brennan expanded the search to every camera in the mall. Exits, parking lots, loading docks. He watched hours of footage, looking for any glimpse of the girls. He found nothing. It was as if they'd walked into the east corridor and evaporated. Brennan knew that wasn't possible. People don't just disappear. There had to be an explanation. A door they went through. A person they left with. Something. Detectives began interviewing everyone who'd been working at the mall on November 9th. Cashiers, stock clerks, security guards, janitors, food court workers. Brennan personally spoke with Melissa Hart, the cashier at Teen Trends. Melissa was 19, a college student working part-time. She remembered Amanda and Rachel clearly. She said they'd tried on a few items, talked about whether they should buy a sweater, but ultimately decided against it. Melissa said they seemed like nice girls, polite, laughing together. She watched them leave the store and turn left. She didn't see where they went after that. Another witness came forward on November 11th. Carl Dawson, a janitor who worked afternoon shift at the mall. He told detectives he'd seen 2 girls matching Amanda and Rachel's description near the service corridors around 3:15. The service corridors were restricted areas, not open to the public, used by employees to move stock and access maintenance areas. Carl said he'd been emptying trash near the east side of the second floor when he noticed 2 girls standing near one of the service doors. He thought it was odd because customers weren't supposed to be back there. He'd started to walk over to tell them they needed to leave, but then he got distracted by a spill someone reported. When he looked back, the girls were gone. Carl said he wasn't 100% certain it was Amanda and Rachel, but the description matched. Brennan immediately ordered a full search of the service corridors, storage rooms, and maintenance areas. Officers and mall security spent an entire day combing through every restricted space in the building. They checked loading docks, electrical rooms, janitorial closets. They searched the roof. They checked the basement levels where old infrastructure and unused storage areas sat in darkness. They found nothing. No sign of the girls. No evidence they'd ever been there. On November 12th, cadaver dogs were brought in. Brennan hated this part. It meant they were preparing for the worst. The dogs worked through the mall, sniffing every corner, every room. They didn't alert to anything. No human remains. Brennan felt a small sense of relief, but it was overshadowed by the growing dread that they were running out of leads. The case exploded in the media. By November 13th, Amanda and Rachel's disappearance was the lead story on every Chicago news station. Their photos were everywhere. Posters went up in stores, on telephone poles, in windows. The girls' faces stared out from flyers that read, "Missing," in bold red letters. Tips started pouring in. A woman in Joliet claimed she'd seen 2 girls matching their description at a gas station. Police investigated. It wasn't them. A man in Aurora said he'd seen them getting into a car with an older man. Detectives followed up. The lead went nowhere. Dozens of tips came in every day, and detectives chased every single one. None of them panned out. The FBI joined the investigation on November 15th. Brennan welcomed the help. Federal agents brought resources, databases, and experience with abduction cases. They ran Amanda and Rachel's information through the National Crime Information Center. They checked for any similar cases in the region. They analyzed the security footage using advanced enhancement software. But even with federal involvement, the case remained a mystery. The girls had simply vanished. Theories began to circulate. Abduction was the most obvious. Someone had taken the girls, either by force or by deception. But how? The mall had been crowded that day. Hundreds of people. If someone had grabbed two girls, someone would have seen it. Someone would have heard screaming, unless the girls went willingly. Maybe someone they knew. Maybe someone posing as an authority figure. But who? Human trafficking was another theory. It was a horrifying possibility, but one that couldn't be ignored. The FBI had seen cases where children were lured or taken from public places and trafficked across state lines. Brennan and the federal agents looked for any evidence of trafficking networks operating in the Chicago area. They found nothing that connected to Amanda and Rachel. Some investigators speculated that someone inside the mall was involved, an employee with access to restricted areas, someone who knew the blind spots in the security cameras. Carl Dawson, the janitor, was interviewed multiple times. His story never changed. He said he might have seen the girls near the service corridors, but he wasn't sure, and he had no idea what happened to them. His background check came back clean. No criminal history. No red flags. Other employees were scrutinized as well. Security guards, maintenance workers, store managers. Everyone's alibis were checked. Everyone's backgrounds were reviewed. Nothing suspicious emerged. Search parties were organized. Volunteers combed the woods near the mall, the parking structures, the surrounding neighborhoods. They searched retention ponds and drainage ditches. They knocked on doors, asking residents if they'd seen anything unusual on November 9th. The community rallied. Hundreds of people showed up to help, but despite the massive effort, no trace of Amanda or Rachel was found. By December, the investigation had slowed. Detectives were still working the case, still following leads, but the momentum had stalled. Brennan spent long hours in his office, reviewing the same footage, the same witness statements, the same reports, hoping to find something he'd missed. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was there, somewhere in the details, but he couldn't see it. Jennifer and David Collins appeared on local news shows, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Jennifer's voice shook as she spoke directly to the camera, begging whoever had taken her daughters to let them go. She said Amanda and Rachel were good girls. They didn't deserve this. Please, she said, please, bring them home. David sat beside her, his face a mask of pain. He told the audience that the family was offering a reward for any information leading to the girls' safe return, $10,000. Later, donors increased it to $50,000. Christmas came and went. The Collins house was silent. No decorations, no tree. Jennifer couldn't bring herself to celebrate. She spent hours in Amanda and Rachel's rooms, lying on their beds, holding their belongings. David threw himself into the search, organizing volunteer efforts, printing more flyers, driving through neighborhoods at night, looking for any sign of his daughters. The strain on their marriage was unbearable. They barely spoke. Grief filled every corner of their lives. By spring of 2004, the case had gone cold. Detectives were still assigned to it, still checking tips as they came in, but the leads had dried up. Brennan refused to give up. He kept the case file on his desk, reviewing it periodically, hoping for a break. But months turned into a year, and Amanda and Rachel Collins remained missing. The investigation had hit a wall, and, somewhere out there, two sisters had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a family shattered by grief and a community haunted by unanswered questions. The years passed slowly for the Collins family. Each day felt longer than the last, stretched thin by the absence of Amanda and Rachel. What started as frantic searching and desperate hope gradually settled into a numb routine of grief and unanswered questions. 20 years is a long time to live without closure. Long enough for a 14-year-old girl to have grown into a woman of 34. long enough for an 11-year-old to have lived an entire adult life. But Amanda and Rachel weren't 34 and 31. They were frozen in time, forever 14, and 11, smiling in photographs that yellowed at the edges. Jennifer Collins never stopped searching. In the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, she'd thrown herself into the investigation, working alongside police, organizing search parties, distributing flyers. But as the case went cold, she realized she needed to do more. In 2005, she founded a nonprofit organization called Bring Them Home, dedicated to supporting families of missing children. She organized awareness campaigns, lobbied for better security measures in public spaces, and connected with other families who'd experienced similar tragedies. Every November 9th, she held a candlelight vigil at Riverside Mall, gathering dozens, sometimes hundreds of people to remember Amanda and Rachel. She spoke at the vigils, her voice steady despite the pain, reminding everyone that her daughters were still out there somewhere, that someone knew something, that the case wasn't closed. David Collins took a different path. The disappearance broke something inside him that never healed. He blamed himself for letting the girls go to the mall alone. He replayed that Saturday morning over and over in his mind, wondering what would have happened if he'd said no, if he'd gone with them, if he'd picked them up early. The guilt consumed him. He stopped going to work regularly. He stopped sleeping. By 2007, he was seeing a therapist and taking medication for depression, but nothing seemed to help. He and Jennifer tried to hold their marriage together, but the weight of their shared grief was too much. They'd lost their daughters, and in the process, they lost each other. In 2011, Jennifer and David separated. It wasn't dramatic or angry. It was quiet, inevitable. They sat at the kitchen table one night and admitted they couldn't do this anymore. David moved into an apartment across town. They stayed in contact, still united by their missing daughters. But the intimacy was gone. David's life became smaller. He worked part-time at a hardware store, attended support groups for parents of missing children, and spent his evenings alone. He kept photos of Amanda and Rachel on his refrigerator, their faces smiling at him every time he opened the door. Jennifer stayed in the house where the girls had grown up. She couldn't leave. Amanda's bedroom remained exactly as it had been on November 9th, 2003. The posters on the walls, the stuffed animals on the bed, the homework still spread across the desk. Rachel's room was the same, frozen, preserved. Jennifer would go into their rooms sometimes and sit on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of her daughters' lives, and try to remember what their voices sounded like. She had videos, of course, old recordings from birthdays and holidays, but it wasn't the same. Memory faded with time, and that terrified her more than anything. Detective Michael Brennan retired from the Naperville Police Department in 2012. He'd spent 9 years working the Collins case, following every lead, reviewing every piece of evidence, hoping for a break that never came. When he retired, he took the case file with him. He kept it in a box in his home office, and every few years, he'd pull it out and go through it again. He'd review the security footage, read the witness statements, look at the bright photos of Amanda and Rachel. He'd ask himself the same questions he'd been asking for years. Where did they go? Who took them? Why couldn't we find them? He never found new answers. Over the years, tips continued to come in. Some were well-meaning but useless. Others were cruel hoaxes. In 2015, a tip came through the FBI that the girls had been spotted in a human trafficking ring operating out of Mexico. Federal agents investigated. They coordinated with Mexican authorities, followed leads across 3 states, interviewed potential witnesses. It took 6 months to determine the tip was false. The girls in question weren't Amanda and Rachel. Jennifer had allowed herself to hope during those 6 months. And when the news came that it was another dead end, it nearly destroyed her. In October of 2023, the Chicago Police Department announced a new initiative. Cold cases with archived security footage would be reviewed using advanced digital forensic technology. The program was part of a broader effort to leverage artificial intelligence and video enhancement software to solve cases that had gone cold before modern technology could be applied. Dozens of cases were flagged for review, prioritized based on media attention, family advocacy, and the likelihood that enhanced footage might reveal new evidence. The Collins case was near the top of the list. Detective Sarah Ortega was assigned to lead the review. She was 38, a specialist in digital evidence and video forensics, with a background in computer science before she joined the police force. Sarah had worked cold cases before, and she knew the process was painstaking: hours of footage, frame-by-frame analysis, dead ends. But she also knew that technology had advanced exponentially in the past 20 years. What investigators couldn't see in 2003 might be visible now with the right software. Sarah started with the Collins case in mid-October. She requested all archived security footage from Riverside Mall, stored on old hard drives and backup tapes that had been sitting in evidence storage for 2 decades. The footage was in poor condition, digitized from analog formats, grainy and low resolution. But that's what the enhancement software was designed for. Sarah loaded the files into a system that used AI-assisted algorithms to clarify images, improve resolution, reduce noise, and isolate details that were invisible to the naked eye in the original footage. The process was slow. Each segment of footage had to be processed, analyzed, and reviewed manually. Sarah settled in for what she knew would be weeks of work. She started with the footage everyone had already seen: Amanda and Rachel entering the mall at 1:15, shopping, eating at the food court, entering Teen Trends, exiting at 3:02. Sarah watched these segments dozens of times, running them through the enhancement software, looking for anything that might have been missed. She studied the girls' faces, their body language, the people around them. She looked for anyone following them, anyone watching them. She found nothing new. The girls appeared normal, relaxed, unaware of any danger. Sarah moved on to the more problematic footage: the East Corridor, the service areas, the parking lots. These were the blind spots, the areas where the cameras hadn't captured clear images. She spent days processing footage from the East Corridor, frame by frame, trying to identify Amanda and Rachel in the crowd. The enhancement software helped, but it wasn't magic. The footage was still grainy. The angles were still poor. Sarah identified dozens of people passing through the corridor between 3 and 4 o'clock, but she couldn't definitively say any of them were the Collins sisters. By late October, Sarah had reviewed most of the primary footage. She'd made notes, flagged potential leads, but nothing significant had emerged. She was starting to feel the frustration that Detective Brennan must have felt 20 years ago. The case was a puzzle with missing pieces. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. There were still sections of footage she hadn't reviewed yet: secondary cameras, service areas, loading docks, places that hadn't been prioritized in the original investigation because they seemed irrelevant. On November 2nd, 2023, exactly 1 week before the 20th anniversary of the disappearance, Sarah was reviewing footage from a camera positioned near the mall's service entrance on the east side of the building. This camera had been overlooked in the original investigation. It was mounted outside, angled toward a door used by maintenance, staff, and delivery personnel. The footage quality was terrible, worse than most of the interior cameras. The angle was awkward, capturing only a narrow slice of the area near the door. Sarah almost skipped it, but something made her stop. She loaded the file into the enhancement software and let it process. The footage covered the entire day of November 9th, 2003. Sarah fast-forwarded through most of it. Delivery trucks, workers coming and going. Nothing unusual. Then, at 3:11 in the afternoon, something caught her eye. 2 small figures appeared at the edge of the frame, walking toward the service entrance. Sarah paused the video. She zoomed in. The figures were blurry, barely visible, but the enhancement software began to clarify the image. Sarah leaned closer to her monitor, her pulse quickening. The two figures were young, girls, one taller than the other. They were wearing hoodies, one red, one blue. Sarah felt her breath catch. She ran the footage through another pass of enhancement, increasing the resolution, reducing the noise. The software worked for several minutes, processing the data. When the image refreshed, Sarah's heart was pounding. She could see their faces now. It was them, Amanda and Rachel Collins. But they weren't alone. Walking beside them, slightly ahead, was a third person, a man. He was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. The footage was brief, less than 4 seconds. The man opened the service door, held it for the girls, and they all disappeared inside. Then the footage returned to an empty frame. Sarah replayed the clip a dozen times. She zoomed in on the man's face, but the angle was too poor and the cap obscured most of his features. She ran the clip through facial recognition software. No match. The database couldn't identify him. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. This was it. This was the moment Amanda and Rachel had disappeared. They'd gone through the service entrance with a man no one had accounted for. Sarah immediately cross-referenced the footage with employee schedules from November 9th, 2003. She pulled up records of everyone who'd been working at the mall that day: maintenance staff, security guards, delivery drivers. She compared their photos to the man in the footage. None of them matched. She checked delivery logs. No deliveries were scheduled for that time at that entrance. She reviewed visitor records. Nothing. Whoever this man was, he shouldn't have been there. Sarah ran the enhanced image through every database she had access to. Criminal records, missing persons, sex offender registries. Nothing came up. The man was a ghost. But he was real. He was there on the footage, walking with Amanda and Rachel, leading them through a door they shouldn't have gone through. Sarah focused on the footage again, zooming out, looking at the broader scene. That's when she noticed something else. In the background, partially visible at the edge of the frame, was a vehicle, a white van. It was parked near the service entrance, just out of the camera's primary field of view. Sarah enhanced the image as much as she could. The van was older, boxy, with a damaged rear bumper. The bumper was bent, hanging at an odd angle, like it had been in an accident and never properly repaired. Sarah zoomed in on the license plate. The angle and resolution made it impossible to read the full number, but she could make out partial characters. She ran the partial plate through vehicle registration databases, narrowing the search to white vans registered in Illinois in 2003. The results came back with over 300 possible matches. Sarah started filtering. She looked for vans with reported damage. She cross-referenced with owner addresses near the mall. She looked for any vehicle that had been flagged in other investigations. It was tedious work, but Sarah was methodical. By late afternoon on November 2nd, Sarah had narrowed the list to 27 possible vehicles. She pulled up registration records for each one, looking at the owners' names, addresses, and any associated criminal history. Most of them were contractors, delivery drivers, or small business owners. Nothing immediately suspicious, but one name caught her attention: Gregory Holt, registered owner of a 1998 Ford Econoline, white, damaged, rear bumper noted in an insurance claim from 2002, address in Naperville, Illinois. Sarah ran Gregory Holt's name through the system. He had no criminal record, no arrests, no warrants. But when she cross-referenced his name with employment records, something came up. Holt had worked as a contract electrician in the Chicago area in the early 2000s. Sarah pulled his work history. Between 2002 and 2004, Holt had been contracted by several companies to do electrical repairs at various locations. One of those locations was Riverside Mall. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She pulled up the mall's maintenance records from November 2003. Gregory Holt's name appeared on a work order dated November 9th. He'd been scheduled to repair faulty wiring in the service corridors on the second floor. The work order had been signed off as completed at 4:30 that afternoon. Sarah sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. Gregory Holt had been at the mall on the day Amanda and Rachel disappeared. He'd been working in the service corridors, the same area where the girls were last seen. He had access to restricted areas. He had a white van with a damaged bumper, and he'd been walking with the girls at 311, leading them through a service entrance. Sarah immediately contacted Lieutenant Tom Hayes, the current head of the cold case unit. She showed him the footage, the enhanced images, the connection to Gregory Holt. Hayes stared at the screen, his expression grim. He told Sarah to find Holt. Now, Sarah ran a current address search. Gregory Holt was still living in Illinois, in a rural property outside Rockford, about 90 miles northwest of Chicago. He was 61 years old. Still, listed as a contract electrician, though his work history showed sporadic employment over the past decade. Sarah pulled up property records for his address, a single-family home on 3 acres, isolated, no neighbors within a quarter mile. Lieutenant Hayes assembled a team, detectives, forensic specialists. A warrant request was drafted and approved within hours. By evening on November 2nd, they had a plan. They'd approach Holt the next morning, execute a search warrant, and bring him in for questioning. Sarah barely slept that night. She kept replaying the footage in her mind. Amanda and Rachel walking with Holt, disappearing through that door, the white van in the background. 20 years. 20 years this footage had existed, sitting in an archive, waiting for someone to look close enough. On the morning of November 3rd, Sarah joined the team heading to Rockford. The drive felt longer than it was. When they arrived at Holt's property, the house looked run down. Peeling, paint, overgrown yard. A white van parked in the driveway. Old, rusted, but unmistakably the same boxy shape as the one in the footage. Sarah's heart was pounding as they approached the front door. Gregory Holt answered on the third knock. He was older, graying, wearing a stained t-shirt and jeans. He looked confused when he saw the police. Lieutenant Hayes identified himself and presented the warrant. Holt's face went pale. He didn't resist. He stepped aside and let them in. The house smelled like mildew and old smoke. The team spread out, beginning the search. Sarah stayed with Hayes as they questioned Holt in the living room. Hayes asked Holt if he remembered working at Riverside Mall in November 2003. Holt hesitated, then said he'd worked at a lot of places back then. He didn't remember specifics. Hayes showed him the enhanced footage on a tablet. Holt stared at the screen. His hands started to shake. He said he didn't know what they were talking about. Hayes asked him directly, "Did you take Amanda and Rachel Collins?" Holt's face crumpled. He looked like he might cry, or confess, or run. But before he could say anything, one of the forensic team members called out from the back of the property. They'd found something in a storage shed. Sarah and Hayes rushed outside, and what they found would finally, after 20 years, bring Amanda and Rachel Collins home. The storage shed behind Gregory Holt's house was locked with a rusted padlock. One of the forensic technicians cut through it with bolt cutters. The door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo across the empty yard. Inside, the shed was dark and smelled like old wood and something else, something stale and disturbing. The team shone their flashlights inside, sweeping the beams across shelves cluttered with tools, old paint cans, and cardboard boxes. One of the technicians spotted a box on a high shelf, pushed toward the back. It was sealed with duct tape, yellowed with age. He pulled it down carefully and set it on a workbench outside. Sarah Ortega stood beside Lieutenant Hayes as the technician cut through the tape and opened the box. Inside were items that had been hidden for 20 years. A backpack, faded blue with pink straps. On the front pocket, stitched in white thread, were the initials A.C. Amanda Collins. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Hayes pulled on gloves and carefully lifted the backpack out of the box. Beneath it were more items. A school ID card in a plastic sleeve. Rachel Collins. Her photo stared up at them, an 11-year-old girl with brown hair and a shy smile. There was clothing, too, a red hoodie, a blue one, both small, sized for children, both stained and wrinkled, preserved in plastic bags like evidence, which is exactly what they were. Hayes turned to look at Gregory Holt, who was standing on the front porch flanked by two officers. Holt's face had gone ashen. He was staring at the ground, his hands trembling. Hayes walked over to him slowly, holding the backpack. He asked Holt if he recognized it. Holt didn't answer. Hayes asked again, his voice harder this time. Holt looked up, his eyes wet, and nodded. "Yes," he said. He recognized it. Hayes told the officers to place Holt under arrest. They read him his rights as they handcuffed him. Holt didn't resist. He looked broken, like a man who'd been carrying a terrible weight for 2 decades and had finally been relieved of it. The team continued searching the property. They found more items in the shed. Tools, rope, a tarp, things that suggested preparation, planning, things that made Sarah feel sick. Holt was taken to the Rockford Police Department for interrogation. Sarah and Hayes followed. The drive back felt surreal. After 20 years, they'd found the man responsible for Amanda and Rachel's disappearance. The evidence was undeniable, but Sarah knew they needed more. They needed Holt to tell them what happened. They needed him to tell them where the girls were. The interrogation room was small and windowless. Holt sat across from Hayes and another detective, a veteran investigator named Marcus Webb. Sarah watched from behind the one-way glass. Holt looked smaller now, hunched over the table, his hands clasped together. Hayes started with the basics. He asked Holt to confirm his name, his address, his employment history. Holt answered in a quiet voice. Yes, he was Gregory Holt. Yes, he'd worked as a contract electrician. Yes, he'd done work at Riverside Mall. Hayes asked him about November 9, 2003. Holt said he didn't remember that specific day. It was 20 years ago. He'd worked at a lot of places. Hayes slid a tablet across the table and showed him the enhanced footage. The image of Holt walking with Amanda and Rachel toward the service entrance. Holt stared at the screen. His breathing quickened. He shook his head and said he didn't know what they were talking about. Hayes leaned forward. He told Holt they'd found the girls' belongings in his shed. He told him they had footage of him with the girls. He told him it was over. There was no point in lying. Holt's composure cracked. He put his face in his hands and started to cry. It was a low, choked sound like someone drowning. Hayes waited. He let the silence stretch, and then Holt started talking. He said he'd been at the mall that day to fix some wiring in the service corridors. It was a routine job. He'd done it before. He said he saw the 2 girls walking near the service entrance. They looked lost, confused. He said he approached them and told them they weren't supposed to be in that area. He said he offered to help them find their way back to the main part of the mall. But then he stopped talking. Hayes pressed him. What happened next? Holt looked up, his face streaked with tears. He said he lied to them. He told them there was a lost puppy in the service corridor. He said Rachel had asked if they could help find it. He said Amanda had hesitated, but Rachel was insistent, so they followed him. Once they were inside the service corridor, Holt said everything changed. He forced them through the service exit to where his van was parked. He said he had a knife. He showed it to them and told them to get in the van. They were terrified, crying, begging, but they got in. He drove them away from the mall. He took them to a property he was renting at the time, a small house in a rural area about 40 miles from the mall. No neighbors, no one around. Hayes asked what happened at the property. Holt said he kept them there for 3 days. He said he didn't hurt them at first. He just kept them locked in a room. He said he didn't know what he was going to do. He said he'd been drinking, not thinking clearly, but by the 3rd day, he realized he couldn't let them go. They'd seen his face. They knew who he was. So, he killed them. He said it quickly, almost clinically, like he was recounting a task he'd completed. He said he strangled them. First Rachel, then Amanda. He said Amanda fought. She scratched his arms. She tried to run, but he was stronger. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat as she listened. Hayes asked Holt what he did with the bodies. Holt said he buried them in a wooded area near the property. He'd wrapped them in tarps and dug a grave deep enough that no one would find them. He said he'd been back to the site a few times over the years, just to make sure it was still undisturbed. He said he'd lived with the guilt every day since. He said he'd thought about turning himself in, but he was too afraid. Hayes asked if Holt would show them where the bodies were buried. Holt nodded. He said he would. He said he was tired of carrying the secret. He said he wanted it to be over. The next morning, November 8th, a team of investigators drove to the location Holt had described. It was a wooded area in a forest preserve about 50 miles from Rockford. Remote, overgrown. The kind of place where you could bury something and no one would ever find it. Holt was brought along, handcuffed, flanked by officers. He led them through the trees, walking slowly, his head down. After about 10 minutes, he stopped. He pointed to a spot beneath a large oak tree. He said that's where they were. Forensic teams began excavating the site. It was painstaking work. They used shovels and brushes, carefully removing layers of soil. Sarah stood at a distance, watching. The air was cold, the sky overcast. After about 2 hours, one of the technicians called out. They'd found something. Fabric, decomposed, but still identifiable. A tarp, beneath it bones, small. The remains of children. The excavation continued through the afternoon. By evening, 2 sets of remains had been carefully removed from the ground. They were transported to the medical examiner's office for analysis. DNA samples were taken and compared to samples from Jennifer and David Collins. The results came back within 48 hours. The remains were confirmed to be Amanda and Rachel Collins. Jennifer received the call on November 10th. Detective Sarah Ortega was the one who told her she'd asked to be the one. She felt she owed it to Jennifer after spending weeks immersed in the case. Sarah sat in her car outside Jennifer's house, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. When Jennifer answered, Sarah identified herself and asked if she could come over. Jennifer said yes, her voice already trembling, already knowing. Sarah sat across from Jennifer in the living room where Amanda and Rachel had grown up. She told Jennifer they'd found the man responsible. She told her they'd recovered the girl's remains. She told her everything, as gently as she could. Jennifer didn't cry at first. She just stared at Sarah, her face blank, like her mind was trying to process information it couldn't fully comprehend. Then she asked how they died, Sarah told her. Jennifer closed her eyes. When she opened them again, tears were streaming down her face. She asked if they suffered. Sarah said she didn't know. The medical examiner couldn't say for certain, but she said it was quick. She didn't know if that was true, but she said it anyway. David was notified separately. He was living in an apartment in Chicago. When detectives told him, he collapsed. He sat on the floor of his apartment and wept. For 20 years, he'd held onto the hope that his daughters were alive somewhere. That hope was gone now. But at least, he knew, at least the not knowing was over. Gregory Holt was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and concealment of homicidal death. His arraignment was scheduled for November 15th. Prosecutors said they would seek the maximum sentence. Holt's public defender indicated his client would plead guilty. There would be no trial. No need to put the family through that. Holt had confessed. The evidence was overwhelming. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. The case made national headlines. News stations ran segments about the breakthrough, how advanced technology had finally solved a 20-year-old cold case, how Detective Ortega's diligence had uncovered the truth hidden in archived footage. True crime communities exploded with discussion. People who'd followed the case for years expressed relief and sorrow. The Collins sisters were finally coming home, but they were coming home in a way no one had wanted. On November 13th, Jennifer and David held a press conference. It was the first time they'd appeared together in years. They stood side by side at a podium outside the Naperville Police Department, microphones pointed at them, cameras recording every word. Jennifer spoke first. She thanked the police, especially Detective Ortega, for never giving up. She said she was devastated but grateful to finally have answers. She said she could finally lay her daughters to rest. David spoke briefly. He said he'd spent 20 years wondering what happened. Now he knew. He said it didn't bring his daughters back, but at least he could stop searching. At least he could say goodbye. Detective Michael Brennan, now 73 and long retired, attended the press conference. He stood in the back of the crowd, his face lined with age and grief. He'd worked the case for years, followed every lead, searched every corner of that mall, and the answer had been there all along, hidden in 4 seconds of footage no one had looked at closely enough. After the press conference, Brennan approached Sarah Ortega. He shook her hand and told her she'd done what he couldn't. Sarah said, "It wasn't her. It was the technology." Brennan shook his head. He said it was her. She'd cared enough to look. That's what mattered. The remains of Amanda and Rachel Collins were released to the family on November 20th. Funeral arrangements were made, and for the first time in 20 years, Jennifer and David could finally bring their daughters home. Jennifer Collins was preparing for the vigil when her phone rang. It was the morning of November 9th, 2023. 20 years to the day since Amanda and Rachel had disappeared. Jennifer had been awake since dawn, organizing candles, printing memorial flyers, going through the same ritual she'd performed every year for 2 decades. When she saw the call was from the Chicago Police Department, her heart stopped. She answered with a shaking hand. Detective Sarah Ortega was on the other end. Her voice was gentle but heavy with the weight of what she was about to say. She told Jennifer they needed to talk in person. Jennifer asked if they'd found something. Ortega said yes. Jennifer asked if her daughters were alive. There was a pause, long and terrible. Ortega said no. Jennifer's legs gave out. She sank to the floor. The phone pressed to her ear, and the world collapsed around her. Ortega arrived at Jennifer's house 30 minutes later. She sat across from Jennifer at the kitchen table and explained everything. The enhanced footage, the man in the dark jacket, the white van, Gregory Holt, the confession, the burial site, the remains. Jennifer listened in, silence, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. When Ortega finished, Jennifer asked how they died. Ortega told her, strangled, 3 days after they were taken. Jennifer closed her eyes and let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, not quite a sob. It was something deeper. The sound of a mother learning her children had been murdered 20 years ago, while she'd spent every day hoping they'd come home. David Collins was notified separately that same morning. 2 detectives went to his apartment in Chicago. When they told him, he couldn't speak. He just stood there in the doorway, his mouth open, his eyes filling with tears. One of the detectives asked if he wanted to sit down. David shook his head. He turned and walked back into his apartment, leaving the door open. The detectives followed him inside and found him sitting on the couch, his face in his hands, his body shaking. He'd spent 20 years imagining this moment, imagining the call that would tell him his daughters were gone forever. But nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. The news broke later that day. Every major outlet ran the story. Collins sisters found after 20 years. Cold case solved using AI technology. Man arrested in 2003 disappearance. The details were everywhere. Gregory Holt's name, his photo, the fact that he'd worked at the mall the day the girls disappeared, the fact that he'd confessed, the fact that he'd buried them in a forest preserve and kept their belongings in a shed for 2 decades. The case that had haunted Illinois for 20 years finally had an answer. But the answer was worse than anyone had imagined. Gregory Holt was formally charged on November 10th. 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, concealment of homicidal death. Prosecutors held a press conference and revealed details that made the case even more disturbing. Holt had a history of predatory behavior. He'd been investigated twice in the 1990s for inappropriate contact with minors, but no charges had been filed. He'd exploited his access to the mall's service areas, areas not covered by primary security cameras. His familiarity with the layout had allowed him to move undetected. He'd planned it. He'd seen an opportunity and taken it. And 2 girls had died because of it. The trial was scheduled for March 2024. Holt's attorney indicated his client would plead guilty. There would be no drawn-out courtroom drama, no appeals to a jury, just a sentencing hearing where the judge would determine how many years Holt would spend in prison. Life, most likely. Multiple life sentences. It didn't matter. Holt was 61. He'd die, behind bars. Either way, on November 20th, Jennifer and David attended the first preliminary hearing. It was the first time they'd been in the same room in over a decade. They arrived separately and sat on opposite ends of the same bench in the courtroom gallery. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't even make eye contact. But when the hearing began and Gregory Holt was led into the room in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, they both stared at him with an intensity that could have burned through steel. Holt kept his eyes down. He didn't look at them. He didn't look at anyone. The hearing lasted less than 30 minutes. Holt's attorney confirmed the guilty plea. The judge set a sentencing date for January. Jennifer and David left the courtroom separately, but as Jennifer walked to her car, she saw David standing in the parking lot, leaning against his truck, his face in his hands. She stopped. For a long moment, she just stood there, watching him. Then she walked over. She didn't say anything. She just stood beside him, and after a moment, David looked up, his eyes red, and nodded. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't forgiveness. It was just 2 people who'd lost the same thing standing together in the wreckage. Detective Michael Brennan attended the hearing as well. He sat in the back row, his hands folded in his lap, his face lined with age and sorrow. He'd spent 9 years working the Collins case, 9 years of dead ends and sleepless nights and unanswered questions, and now, 15 years after he'd retired, the case was finally solved. But Brennan didn't feel relief. He felt anger. Anger that it had taken 20 years. Anger that the answer had been there all along, hidden in 4 seconds of footage no one had thought to enhance. Anger that Amanda and Rachel had been within reach for 3 days before they were killed, and no one had found them in time. After the hearing, Brennan approached Sarah Ortega outside the courthouse. He told her he'd been following the case, that he was grateful she'd found what he couldn't. Ortega told him it wasn't about who found it. It was about the fact that it was found at all. Brennan nodded, but his expression didn't change. He said he'd think about those girls for the rest of his life. He said he'd see their faces every time he closed his eyes. Ortega told him she understood. She said she probably would too. The funeral was held on December 2nd, 2023. It was a cold, gray day. The service took place at a church in Naperville, the same church where Jennifer and David had been married 30 years earlier. Hundreds of people attended. Family, friends, strangers, who'd followed the case for years and felt connected to the girls they'd never met. The caskets were small, white, closed. Amanda and Rachel's remains had been cremated, but Jennifer wanted the service to feel complete. She wanted her daughters to have a proper goodbye. Jennifer spoke at the service. She stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edges, her voice shaking but resolute. She thanked everyone who'd come. She thanked Detective Ortega and the team who'd never given up. She thanked the community for keeping Amanda and Rachel's memory alive for 20 years. She said she could finally say goodbye, but the pain would never leave. She said she'd spent 2 decades hoping her daughters would walk through the door. Now she knew they never would. But at least she knew. At least the not knowing was over. She said Amanda and Rachel deserved to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. 2 sisters who loved each other. 2 girls who were kind and smart and full of life. 2 daughters who were taken too soon. David didn't speak at the service. He sat in the front row, his face blank, his hands clasped together. When it was over, he walked to the caskets and placed his hand on each one. He stood there for a long time, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. Jennifer watched from a few feet away. Then she walked over and stood beside him. They didn't touch. They didn't speak. But they stood together, two parents saying goodbye to the children they'd lost 20 years ago. The Riverside Mall remained abandoned. After the case made headlines, it became a grim landmark. People drove past it and pointed. That's where those girls disappeared. That's where it happened. The building sat empty, boarded up, a monument to tragedy. There was talk of tearing it down, but nothing came of it. It just sat there, decaying, a ghost of what it had once been. The story didn't end with closure. There was no sense of resolution, no feeling that justice had been served. Gregory Holt would spend the rest of his life in prison, but that didn't bring Amanda and Rachel back. It didn't erase 20 years of grief. It didn't undo the damage that had been done to Jennifer and David, to their family, to everyone who'd loved the girls. The case was solved, but the wound was still open. It would always be open. What haunted everyone most was the timing. Amanda and Rachel had been alive for 3 days after they were taken. 3 days. If the police had found them in time, they might have survived. If the security footage had been enhanced in 2003 instead of 2023, Gregory Holt might have been caught before he killed them. The technology hadn't existed back then, but that didn't make it any less painful to think about. The answers had been there all along, buried in the footage, waiting for someone to look closer. And in that waiting, 2 decades of grief had unfolded. Jennifer returned to her house after the funeral. She walked through the rooms where Amanda and Rachel had grown up. She stood in their bedrooms, which she'd kept exactly as they'd been for 20 years. She'd thought about changing them, turning them into something else, but she couldn't. Now she knew she never would. These rooms were all she had left. Photographs, clothes, stuffed animals. The remnants of lives that had been stolen. David went back to his apartment alone. He sat on the couch and stared at the photos of his daughters on the refrigerator. He thought about the last time he'd seen them. That Saturday morning in November 2003. He'd been reading the newspaper when they came downstairs for breakfast. He'd barely looked up. If he'd known it was the last time, he would have said something. He would have hugged them. He would have told them he loved them, but he hadn't known. No one ever knows. Detective Sarah Ortega returned to work the following week. She had other cases to review, other cold files waiting for her attention. But she couldn't stop thinking about Amanda and Rachel. She'd spent weeks immersed in their story, watching footage of them walking through the mall, laughing, unaware of what was about to happen. She'd seen them disappear into that service corridor. She'd found the man who'd taken them, but it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt heavy. The Collins case became a cautionary tale. It was featured in training seminars for police departments across the country. It was discussed in forensic technology conferences. It was analyzed in true crime documentaries. But for Jennifer and David, for their families, for everyone who'd loved Amanda and Rachel, it wasn't a case study. It was their life. It was 20 years of searching and hoping and grieving. It was the knowledge that their daughters had been murdered and buried in the woods while the world moved on around them. It was the unbearable reality that sometimes the missing are closer than we think, hidden in the earth, hidden in the footage, waiting to be found. And in that waiting, the living are left behind, carrying the weight of what was lost, holding onto memories that fade a little more with each passing year, until all that remains is grief and the echo of voices that will never be heard again.